The woman behind the counter at Fifth Third Bank didn't look at me the way bank tellers usually do. She looked at me the way people look at someone who doesn't yet know they've been hurt. "Mr. Ashworth," she said quietly, "before I process anything today, I need to ask you something." She glanced at her manager's office, then back at me. "Did you authorize a wire transfer of $412,000 last Thursday?" I set my coffee down on the counter. "No," I said. "I did not." She nodded slowly, like she'd been hoping I'd say something different. Let me back up. 11 months ago, I was standing in a Sunoco station on Bridgetown Road in Cincinnati, waiting for my car to finish filling up and buying a Mega Millions ticket the same way I had every Tuesday and Friday for the past 19 years. Helen, my wife of 31 years, had started the habit. She'd pick the numbers every time, 2 from our anniversary date, 1 from each of our birthdays, and then whatever she felt like for the last 2, she called it her personal math. I called it a waste of $2. We argued about it lovingly every week until the morning she didn't wake up. That was 3 years ago. A stroke in her sleep. So quiet and sudden that I still sometimes forget she's gone until I reach the kitchen, and the coffee is only enough for one. After Helen died, I kept buying the tickets. Not because I thought I'd win, because it was the last argument I let her have. That Tuesday in October, I scratched. No, I didn't scratch anything. That's not how Mega Millions works. I checked the numbers on my phone, standing under the fluorescent lights of the Sunoco while the pump clicked. Then I checked again. Then I sat down on the curb of the parking lot because my legs stopped working correctly. 5 of 6 numbers matched, plus the mega ball. I want to be careful about what I say here, because a lot of people have a fantasy about this moment. In the fantasy, it's joyful. In reality, I sat on that curb and cried for about 4 minutes, and it wasn't happiness I was crying about. It was the fact that Helen had been right for 19 years and she wasn't here to collect. She never got to say "I told you so," and that felt like losing her all over again, just differently. After taxes, the lump sum came out to $2,160,000. The Lottery Commission's office was calm and professional about it. My financial advisor, a steady woman named Patricia, who I'd worked with for 12 years, helped me set up a trust and move most of it into diversified accounts. I kept a working account with enough liquidity for anything reasonable. Patricia was careful, methodical, and suspicious of anything that sounded exciting. I liked that about her. I told 3 people. My daughter in Portland, who sobbed for 20 minutes and told me I deserved every penny. My friend Garrett, who'd been my closest friend since we worked the same postal route in the 90s, and who reacted by buying me a steak dinner and never mentioning the money again, which is exactly the kind of person Garrett is. And my nephew. My nephew was 39 years old. His father, my younger brother, had been in and out of rehabilitation facilities since his nephew was 11. And somewhere along the way, I'd become the stable male presence in the boy's life. I coached his little league team. I drove him to his SAT prep classes. I sat in the front row at his community college graduation. Helen had loved him like a son, and when she died, he was one of the first people at my door, standing there with red eyes and a bag of groceries because he didn't know what else to bring. I want to be honest about who he was to me. He wasn't a peripheral nephew I saw at Thanksgiving. He was as close to a son as I had, and that matters for everything that comes after. His wife was another story. She was pleasant in the way that certain people are pleasant as a strategy rather than a disposition. She remembered birthdays, sent Christmas cards with personalized notes, touched your arm when she talked to you. Helen had noticed it first, the way she always noticed things. "There's a ledger behind those eyes," Helen told me once after a family dinner. "Every nice thing she does, she's writing it down. She expects to get paid back." I told Helen she was reading too much into things. Helen gave me a look that said she wasn't. They got married 4 years ago. After the wedding, my nephew's financial situation, which had always been unsteady, began to deteriorate in ways I didn't fully understand at first. He'd started a landscaping and outdoor renovation company 2 years earlier. It had some early success, enough for him to lease equipment and hire a small crew. Then a large contract fell through. Then the equipment lease payments got harder to meet. His wife, who I'll refer to from here as my nephew's wife because I have a hard time using her name without feeling my jaw tighten, had expensive habits that predated the tight finances and didn't adjust to accommodate them. I knew some of this, not all of it. My nephew didn't confide in me the way he used to. When I told him about the lottery winnings, he came to my house that same evening. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Helen and I used to do our crosswords, and he cried. Real tears, I think. He hugged me and said, "Uncle Walt, you deserve this. You worked so hard your whole life." He stayed for 2 hours, and we talked about Helen and my brother and all the years in between. And when he left, I felt something I hadn't felt since Helen died, which was the particular warmth of being known by someone. That was October. By January, the calls started getting different. Not dramatically different, just a degree or two off from where they'd always been. He'd call to check in, which he always did, but then the conversation would drift toward his business, the equipment situation. A commercial account he was trying to land, a competitor underbidding him. I listened. I gave advice when he asked for it. I didn't offer money, because Patricia had told me clearly that the first year after a windfall is when you're most vulnerable to pressure, and that I should let a full year pass before making any significant gifts. I agreed with her reasoning. I'd planned to help my nephew eventually, sensibly, in ways that were structured and protected, but not yet, and not reactively. In February, my nephew and his wife invited me to dinner at their house. I went. The food was good, the wine was good, and halfway through the meal his wife brought out a folder. "We've been working on something exciting," she said, smiling the way she always smiled. "We found a property. Commercials, we've run the numbers, and the return potential is extraordinary." My nephew leaned forward. "It's a real opportunity, Uncle Walt. This is exactly the kind of thing that could turn everything around for us." I looked at the folder. I looked at the two of them, and I thought about what Helen had said about the ledger behind her eyes. All those Christmas cards, all those birthday calls, all that arm-touching. I thought about when the deposit had been made into that ledger and what the expected withdrawal looked like. I told them I wasn't in a position to make any investments right now, that Patricia was managing everything carefully and I wanted to stay the course. I said it kindly, I said it firmly. My nephew's smile didn't waver for the first 30 seconds, but then something shifted underneath it. I'd seen that shift in students I'd disciplined over 22 years as a principal. The moment when someone realizes the answer is actually no, not just not yet. His wife handled it better than he did. "Of course," she said, covering his hand with hers. "We understand completely. We just wanted to share it with you because you've always been such a big part of our plans." She said it without a trace of resentment, and that, somehow, was the thing that unsettled me most. I drove home that night with a cold feeling I couldn't name. The calls continued. Sometimes it was my nephew alone, walking back through the same investment pitch with different angles. Sometimes it was both of them together, his wife's voice in the background. In March, he came by the house unannounced on a Saturday morning with coffee and pastries and spent an hour talking about how much pressure he was under, how the bank was making noise about the equipment loans, how his wife was struggling with the stress of it all. He didn't directly ask me for money that morning. He just described the situation in full color, in careful detail, until I felt it pressing on me the same way it was pressing on him. I didn't give him anything. I started calling Garrett more. Garrett, who never talked about my money, who met me every Wednesday morning at a diner on Beachmont Avenue and talked about baseball and neighborhood politics and the general absurdity of getting older. Garrett noticed things without making them a conversation. One Wednesday in April, he looked at me over his coffee cup and said, "You seem tired in a specific way." I told him it was family stuff. He nodded and didn't push. Garrett was like that. I also started paying closer attention to my accounts. Patricia had set up online access, and I'd check the balances every few days, not because I was nervous exactly, but because I'd started to feel like I should know where things stood. And that's how I ended up at Fifth Third Bank on a Thursday morning in early May, looking at a teller who was looking at me like someone who didn't yet know they'd been hurt. The wire transfer of $412,000 had gone to a business account. The business account belonged to my nephew's landscaping company. My signature was on the authorization documents. My signature, except that I had never signed anything, and the handwriting was close but not quite mine, a degree of pressure wrong, the loop on the W slightly too wide. I stood at that counter for a long time. The bank manager, A man named Bernard, who had processed my account since Helen and I refinanced our mortgage in 2007, came out and sat me down in his office and closed the door. He told me he'd had a feeling something was wrong when the transfer came through because the dollar amount was outside my normal pattern and because the authorization documents had come in by fax rather than through my secure online portal. He'd flagged it internally and put a temporary hold pending my verification. The money had not yet left the account. I'm not a man who cries easily. I'd cried twice in my adult life before Helen died, and both times were at funerals. But sitting in Bernard's office, looking at a photocopy of a document bearing a forgery of my name, I felt something come apart inside my chest. Not because of the money, because of who had signed it. I called Patricia from the parking lot. Then I called my daughter, who answered on the first ring because she always answers on the first ring and always has, the same anxious attentiveness she'd had since she was a child. She listened without interrupting, which meant she was very upset, because my daughter usually has a comment for everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I'm getting on a plane." I told her she didn't need to do that. She didn't listen to me, which is also something she's done her whole life. I did not call my nephew. The police came to my house the next morning. A detective named Okafor, methodical and unhurried, who went through the documents with me and took photographs and asked careful questions. He told me the forgery was evident to any handwriting expert and that the funds transfer had a digital trail. He asked if I had any idea who might have had access to my personal information, account numbers, signature examples. I told him who I thought had done it. I told him why. I watched him write it down without any visible reaction, the way detectives do, and I appreciated that he didn't offer me any false sympathy. That afternoon, my daughter arrived from Portland with a rolling carry-on and the look on her face that meant she was going to handle things whether I wanted her to or not. She went through everything with me, the documents, the timeline, my phone records, all the conversations I'd had with my nephew over the previous months. She laid it out on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Uncle Walt," she said, "she's called me that since she was 5. No, wait, I need to correct myself." My daughter called him by name and said, "He did this. I know you don't want it to be true, but he did this." I told her I knew. She put her hand on mine, and we sat in Helen's kitchen, and neither of us said anything for a while. The investigation moved quickly once it started. Detective Okafor was thorough in the way quiet people often are. The digital trail from the wire transfer authorization led to a fax machine at a copy center 3 miles from my nephew's house, a business that had security cameras. The timestamp on the fax matched security footage showing my nephew's wife walking in carrying a folder and walking out 7 minutes later. What neither she nor my nephew had accounted for was the second piece. My nephew's wife, it turned out, was a careful woman in ways that ultimately became her undoing. She kept records of everything. It was the same quality that had made her such a diligent Christmas card sender, such a precise keeper of social debts. Her phone had a voice memo application she used to document important conversations. The police, executing a search warrant on their home, found 18 months of recordings stored on a cloud backup, including 3 conversations where she and my nephew discussed in specific detail the plan to forge my signature and transfer money, including one conversation where my nephew said, and I was shown this transcript so I am not guessing, "He's not going to notice until it's too late. And if he does notice, we tell him he's losing it. Get a doctor to say he's not managing his affairs properly. Walt's 66 and he's been depressed since Helen died. Nobody's going to question it." My nephew had planned to declare me mentally incompetent. If the forgery hadn't been caught by Bernard's diligence, the next step would have been to question my cognitive fitness, build a paper trail suggesting I was in decline, and pursue legal guardianship over my financial affairs. When Detective Okafor showed me that transcript, I was sitting in my living room in the chair that used to be Helen's. I read the words carefully, the way I used to read student incident reports, looking for the facts before the feeling. Then I set the paper down on the armrest and looked out the window at the backyard, where Helen's garden had gone mostly unattended since she died. I thought about the Little League games. I thought about the SAT prep drives. I thought about the evening in October when he sat at my kitchen table and cried and told me I deserved this. I thought about what Helen would have said. She would have said, "I told you about the ledger." The police arrested both of them on a Tuesday morning. my nephew for forgery, attempted theft, and wire fraud, his wife for the same charges plus conspiracy. I heard from Detective Okafor that my nephew, when the officers came to his door, asked to make one phone call and that the call was to me. I wasn't home. I'm not sure what I would have said if I had been. Garrett came over that evening. He didn't ask about the arrest or the charges or any of the details. He brought 2 sandwiches and a 6-pack of something local, and we sat on the back porch and watched the light go out of the sky over Helen's garden. At some point he said, "I'm sorry, Walt." I told him I was too. He nodded and handed me another beer, and we left it there, which was exactly right. My daughter stayed for 2 weeks. In that time, she helped me coordinate with Patricia to ensure all accounts were properly secured, worked with the bank to install additional verification protocols on any transfers, and spent considerable time going through what the legal proceedings were likely to look like. She was efficient and thorough, and also, underneath all of that, heartbroken, in a way she was trying not to show me. She and my nephew had grown up together at family events. She'd been a bridesmaid at his wedding. On the morning she left for the airport, we stood in the kitchen and she held my coffee mug in both hands the way she used to hold her juice glass when she was small. "Dad," she said, "you can't disappear into this." I told her I had no intention of disappearing. She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when she wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth. I promised her I'd call every few days. She hugged me for a long time at the door. Bernard, the bank manager, came by my house 2 weeks after the arrest. He'd heard I was doing okay and wanted to check in. We sat on the porch, and I made coffee, and he told me he'd almost not flagged the transfer, that it had been within the margin of what sometimes gets approved on a first pass, that if he'd been less attentive that particular morning it might have gone through. He seemed to need me to understand how close it had been. I told him I understood completely. I also told him I was grateful in a way that was hard to articulate, the kind of grateful that sits deeper than words. Bernard was not a dramatic person, and he shifted in his chair a little, uncomfortable with the weight of it. "I just did what you're supposed to do," he said. I told him that was rarer than he thought. The trial took 8 months from arrest to verdict. My nephew's lawyer argued that his wife had been the primary architect of the plan and that he had been, in her sphere, a man who made a catastrophically wrong decision under financial duress. The recordings told a different story. My nephew's voice on those memos was not the voice of a man being led somewhere he didn't want to go. He participated fully, offered suggestions, raised logistics. The jury heard everything. I was in the courtroom every day. Not because I wanted to watch him suffer, because I owed it to the truth of what happened to bear witness to it clearly. My nephew's wife was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 7 years. My nephew was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 4 years with the possibility of early release for good behavior. As the sentence was read, my nephew looked at me from across the courtroom. It was the first time our eyes had met directly since before the arrest. I don't know exactly what I expected to see, rage or shame or blankness. What I saw was something smaller and more honest than any of those things. He looked like a man who had, in a very final way, understood the distance between who he'd believed himself to be and who he'd actually become. I held his gaze until he looked away. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Garrett was waiting with his hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't say anything when I came out. He just walked down the steps beside me, and we went and had lunch at the diner on Beachmont Avenue, and we talked about baseball. I didn't visit my nephew for the first 14 months. My daughter went twice. She told me he was different, that he'd lost weight, that he spent time in the prison library and was working toward a certification in project management, that he asked about me carefully and never with any suggestion of expectation. I listened to this and said very little. I wasn't ready, and I knew that I owed it to both of us to wait until I was. In the 15th month, I drove to the correctional facility on a Wednesday morning. The visiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. My nephew came through the door in the facility uniform and sat across from me at the table, and for almost a full minute neither of us said anything. He looked older than 39, not in a dramatic way, but in the way that a certain kind of hard season ages a person accurately, gets them to where they were always going to end up, just faster. "I don't have anything to say that's worth what I did," he said finally. I told him I hadn't come to hear an explanation. I'd come because he was still my blood, and I'd promised Helen, without ever saying it out loud, that I would not become someone who walked away from the people who needed him. He looked down at the table. Aunt Helen would have been so ashamed of me. I told him yes, she would have been. I told him she also would have shown up to this visiting room, because that was who she was. He didn't cry. He was very still for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, "I keep thinking about Little League, the tournament game in Milford. You drove 4 hours round trip for a game that rained out and you never complained once. I don't know why that's the thing I keep thinking about. But it is." I remembered that game. I remembered he'd been so disappointed he hadn't spoken the whole drive home, and I'd played the radio softly and let the silence be what it needed to be. "I need you to understand something," I told him. "I'm not here to forgive you. I'm not there yet, and I won't tell you I am when I'm not. But I'm here, and I'll come back. That's what I can give you right now." He nodded. His jaw was tight in the way it had been when he was a boy, trying not to show he was upset. We talked for an hour, about his certifications, about the project management coursework, about his father, my brother, who was somewhere in Tennessee, and apparently sober for almost 2 years now, something neither of us had known how to feel about. I told him I'd called my brother after the arrest, and that we'd talked for the first time in a long time. He seemed surprised by that. I told him that things collapsing sometimes shook other things loose, not always bad things. When the visit ended, and the guard indicated it was time, my nephew stood and looked at me across the table with an expression I didn't have a word for. "Thank you for coming," he said. I told him I'd see him in a month. I drove home on the interstate with the windows cracked even though it was only 50 degrees out, the way Helen and I used to do on long drives. And I thought about the word ruin. I thought about how you could ruin someone and not know it, or how someone could let themselves be ruined and not understand that they were choosing it until it was done. I thought about my nephew and his wife and the ledger she kept behind her eyes, all those deposits of kindness she'd made into his trust in her, and how he'd spent everything he had to honor debts she'd convinced him were real. His wife was released from prison after 4 years on a modified sentence. I have no information about where she went or what she became. I have thought about her fewer times than you might expect, because I found that carrying resentment toward her required more energy than she had earned. My nephew was released after 3 years and 2 months. He called me from a halfway house in Covington on the day he got out. The call was brief. He said he was working, that he'd gotten a job at a small landscaping outfit run by a veteran through a workforce reentry program, that he wasn't asking me for anything except to tell me he was trying. I told him that was good to hear. I told him I'd call him next week. He said, "Okay." There was a pause in which I think both of us understood that we were navigating something that had no map, and that we were both willing to try anyway. I did call him the next week. And the week after. Bernard at the bank retired last spring. I attended his retirement party at a restaurant on the east side, shook his hand in the parking lot afterward, and told him that because of him I still had my house and Helen's garden, and the ability to sleep without wondering what had been taken from me. He shook my hand again and looked at the ground with the particular discomfort of a man who was raised not to accept compliments gracefully. I told him I was investing in his retirement anyway, and that my financial advisor had already been in touch with his wife about setting up a fund for their grandchildren's education. He started to protest, and I told him to take it up with Patricia because she doesn't negotiate. He laughed and told me Helen had trained me well. I told him she absolutely had. Patricia put the rest of the money to work quietly and sensibly, the way she does everything. My daughter's children have education trusts they won't be able to access until they're 24, old enough to have figured out something about who they are. I donated to 2 organizations that support widowers' mental health programs. Because those first 18 months after Helen died, I spent a lot of time alone in ways that weren't good for me, and I knew I wasn't the only one. I fixed the gutters on the house that had needed attention for 2 years. I bought a better chair for the porch, and I kept Helen's garden. This past spring, I spent 3 weekends clearing out what had overgrown and restoring what she'd designed. It's not perfect the way she would have kept it. My thumb is more brown than green, and I have to look up most of what she planted from memory. But the roses came back in June, which I chose to regard as a comment from Helen rather than a coincidence. My nephew started his own small business this past fall. 3 employees, basic landscaping and cleanup work, the kind of unglamorous, honest work that builds from nothing. He didn't ask me for money to start it. He saved up and got a small business loan and did it himself. When he told me on the phone, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a long time, something that predated the BMW lease and the investment pitches and the forged signatures. Something that sounded like the kid who built elaborate projects out of whatever materials were on hand because he liked the process of making something work. I told him I was proud of him. There was a pause on the line. "That means a lot," he said. "I meant it. We're not back to where we were. I don't think we'll get there." There's a version of trust that, once it's been broken at that depth, doesn't reassemble the same way. You can't unknow what someone was willing to do, but you can, I've found, choose to sit next to what you know and still extend a hand. Not because the record is clean, because you've decided that the relationship is worth the ongoing work of honesty. Helen would have had something precise to say about all of this. She was better with words than I ever was. She would have quoted something or found the exact right phrase to name the thing I'm still feeling my way around. I miss that. I miss being the person who got to hear her get it right. But I have the garden, and the Wednesday mornings with Garrett, and the weekly calls with my daughter who still answers on the first ring and probably always will, and my nephew rebuilding something real with his own hands on ground he had to earn back. And I have the knowledge that when it mattered, when the moment came that tested everything, Bernard was paying attention. A man I'd done ordinary business with for 18 years chose diligence over convenience, and it saved me. Not just financially. In a deeper sense, a man I had no blood claim on chose to act with integrity toward me, and my own blood chose otherwise. That accounting has stayed with me. It tells me something about where character actually lives, not in genetics or family trees or shared history. In what a person decides to do with the small, unwitnessed moments when it would be easier to do nothing. Every Tuesday and Friday, I still stop at the Sunoco on Bridgetown Road. I still buy the ticket. I still check the numbers on my phone under the fluorescent lights. I haven't won again and I don't expect to, but I keep the ritual. Helen was right about the winning. She was right about Nicole, about my nephew's wife. She was right about the ledger. She was right about most things, which was both infuriating and one of the great privileges of my life. The least I can do is keep playing her numbers.